At this point, you guys already know what the Pokemon franchise's reputation is. Look up anything Pokemon related online and you'll see the same old discussion about the animations, how easy the games are nowadays, and how people are being deprived of their favourite Pokemon. People note that this decline in quality started with Sword and Shield, but I personally believe it goes back as far as Generation 6. On the topic of Sword and Shield, with Generation 8 they tried to integrate a new method of discovering Pokemon. This was their first attempt, so I can be somewhat forgiving with it, but Legends Arceus will not get that luxury. Generation 8's wild area felt very lackluster. I rarely ever felt any incentive to explore this massive area because of how little there is to do within it. Usually, the biggest reason to adventuring the wild area would be to find a specific Pokemon you want to use, but when you've collected your full team of 6 and are dead set on using them for the rest of the game, then that reason becomes moot. You could argue that another reason would be to discover held items to give to your Pokemon, but simply just discovering items you can use isn't engaging enough. In Breath of the Wild, you'd often have to fight enemies or solve a puzzle to get your hands on the good stuff. You could make the argument that it's just in Zelda's nature to engage you in interesting puzzles, and that the Pokemon series has never really reflected this, but still in Sword and Shield an item will just be sitting there out in the open. Collecting them doesn't feel rewarding, and there's nothing that exists to engage you in the act of exploring. The lack of anything to do therefore was my biggest criticism of Generation 8's wild area. With my critical view of its predecessor out of the way, how exactly does Legends Arceus stand up with its own approach to an open world Pokemon game? Well, for starters, the game has an obsession of being absolutely fluid. What I mean by that exactly is that transitioning into Pokemon battles is now more seamless than ever. If you want to start a battle, then all you need to do is cycle through which Pokemon you want to use and throw them at the opposing Pokemon. You're engaged in battle in just a matter of seconds, and the transition from being within the open world to the battle itself feels incredibly smooth. This extends even further to when you want to exit a battle. It's as simple as just walking away and in a matter of seconds you're back to exploring. One of my favourite things to do in this game was throw out an attack during battle and then just instantly start walking away. By doing this I was able to save so much time when I was traversing the world. The battles themselves felt incredibly clean also. I don't think I ever went into a menu besides the fight one to choose an action. Pokeballs, items and Pokemon can all be cycled through during the battle at any time, and it's just a matter of pressing ZR to use them. I honestly think I'm going to have a hard time replaying previous entries now that these features have been introduced. Another element of the game that makes it feel fluid is travelling around with the Pokemon you can ride. Depending on what situation you're in, the game will often automatically switch to the corresponding ride Pokemon. Even if it doesn't, you'll always get a prompt to summon them when they're needed. With that being said, the riding system does have issues of its own. What was entirely not fluid, however, was navigating to other areas around the world. As you've probably seen by now, this game isn't a full open world game. The map is divided into a hub area and 5 other areas which you can explore. To reach these areas, you have to select them on your map within Jubilife Village and then you'll be teleported to them. It was incredibly tedious when I wanted to go somewhere else but had to first go back to the village and then select where I wanted to go. I have no idea why the option to teleport to other areas from everywhere wasn't implemented. Other open world games on the Switch such as Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade Chronicles don't do this, so why does this game make it so out of the way to go to somewhere else? Whilst on the subject of the game's open world, I gotta say it really doesn't do much better than Sword and Shield when it comes to making areas to explore engaging and interesting. On the one hand, catching Pokemon is the most fun it's ever been. You have quite a lot of approaches this time around. For example, you could walk up to it and start killing it, but this approach won't work for Pokemon that have a habit of running away. Instead, you might want to utilise the nearby grass and lure them in with their favourite food. This new approach to catching Pokemon makes traversing around the world fun, as whenever you encounter one that you want to catch, you have to think about how you want to go about doing it. The game also places a higher emphasis on catching Pokemon, which resolves the previous issue I mentioned about catching Pokemon becoming pointless when you have a full team of 6. With all of that being said, however, this is really the only thing you can do when exploring the game. There aren't any puzzles around the world you can solve, there aren't any mini dungeons you can explore, there's nothing around to engage you in doing something in exchange for a reward. I mentioned earlier that at least Sword and Shield scattered items across its wild area to make it somewhat worthwhile to explore, but this game doesn't have that advantage. I never felt the need to uncover every nook and cranny of this game because I knew nothing would be there. You could make the argument that discovering the Spiritomb Wisps acts as an incentive to explore the world. To that I say that side quest needs to burn in hell. The game's lack of things to do in the world ties into another criticism I have about the game, the removal of abilities and held items. If held items were still in the game, they could have been scattered around the world and locked behind puzzles or fights or something to make the game more worthwhile to explore and engaging whilst doing so. In games such as Breath of the Wild and Genshin Impact, there is always something you can do nearby. Whenever I was playing these two games, I was always sidetracked doing something else other than the main story, and when an open world game successfully does this, that's how you know it's a good open world game. I never felt compelled to do anything other than the quests in Legends Arceus, however. Going back to the topic of held items and abilities, the removal of these two things makes the game feel less customizable and strategic. I have no idea why Pokemon games nowadays are obsessed with taking away features that have been proven to make the game more fun and engaging. With that being said, I'm really happy with the game's changes and additions to battling. The agile and strong style mechanics adds a lot more strategic depth, and it's nice to see a mechanic integrated into battling that isn't just an anime trope. With agile style attacks, you're more likely to have more turns in a fight, but this comes at the cost of weakening a move's power. With strong style attacks, you're giving your opponents more chances to attack in exchange for a move doing more damage. I never felt as if I was using one more than the other, as both had their advantages and disadvantages. When catching Pokemon, I often used agile style attacks to weaken them first and then use a move such as Hypnosis to increase my chances of catching them before they could fight back. When fighting trainers, however, I felt more inclined to use strong style attacks. Despite this, however, I always felt like I had to think about which type of attack I wanted to use. I frequently found myself in the same dilemma of wanting to use a strong style attack, but fearing that it wouldn't quite knock out the enemy, resulting in them getting more attacks. That's by no means a bad thing. I honestly welcome any kind of system which gets me to think instead of just mashing buttons to get a fight over and done with. This system of battling is very similar to the lane system in Ruined King, and whilst I do think that game fleshes out the system a bit more, that doesn't discredit Pokemon's approach to this way of fighting because it's still a good mechanic. I really hope agile and strong style attacks return in future entries because, like I said, they add a lot more strategic depth. Legends Arceus also seems to have entirely revamped the way moves and status conditions work. For example, Stealth Rocks is no longer an entry hazard, but instead a single attack with a lingering damage effect. Putting a Pokemon to sleep no longer means that they can't do anything for a few turns, but instead have a chance to have their turn be skipped. I get the feeling a lot of returning players will hate having their prior information to moves and status conditions become irrelevant, but I honestly really enjoyed the amount of changes the game brought in. A big part of Legends Arceus' aesthetic is that this game takes place during a time where not much is really known about Pokemon, and discovery is at its highest. As such, because of these changes, it felt like I myself was placed into a system that I didn't really know much about. It was up to me to discover and understand how all the new moves and statuses work. As such, the major changes of the game really enhanced that feeling of discovering something new. You can't just rely on your old Pokemon knowledge, you have to figure out how it all works, just like how the characters themselves are discovering the world. With all of these new changes to the battle system, I found it quite a shame that there were so few Pokemon battles that you could have with trainers. Unlike all of the other mainline Pokemon games, there aren't any trainers throughout the world that you can encounter and challenge to a battle. Fights with other characters were limited to only occurring during story progression, so it's a real shame that all of the changes and additions to battling are shown in light of only a few battles. With that being said, the battles that do occur don't feel too hard, nor do they feel too easy. Even though most enemy teams usually have up to 3 Pokemon, the fights that I did encounter ended up wiping out at least half of my team. It never felt like I was mashing a button and instantly sweeping enemy teams. The damage that enemy trainers' Pokemon could output was no joke. However, I should make it clear that I didn't really take advantage of any of the EXP candies or the EV boosting items, so perhaps that played a part in why I found fights more challenging. This game also has, in my opinion, one of the best boss fights in any Pokemon game to date, which I'll discuss later on because of spoilers. Another addition to the game was the introduction of arena-based fights, where you're constantly tasked with dodging a Pokemon's attacks while throwing bombs at them. When they're stunned, you can throw out a Pokemon to attack them and weaken their overall health bar even more. I don't want to go too in-depth about these fights, as I'm planning on making an even more in-depth review later on, and I'll have much more to say about them there. Just know that I really enjoyed these fights. I love it when a game integrates mechanics that involve you balancing having to dodge and attack enemies. However, I must say that sometimes it felt like they were really trying to push what the Switch was capable of, and not in a good way. All of these boss fights take place against already existing Pokemon that have Hisuian forms. Some of these designs were more of a miss for me, but one of my personal favourites is Hisuian Lilligant. Whilst we're on the subject of how things look, this might be a good time to segue into how the game looks. See, the thing about this game is that whenever I was playing it, I never really stopped to notice how the game looks. I wasn't outright disgusted by it, nor was I enticed by its visuals. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing though. A lot of people may say that they don't care about the graphics, but I personally believe that moments to take in the beauty of how a game looks contributes to a person's overall enjoyment to a game just as much as its gameplay. Why settle for fun and engaging mechanics when you can have breathtaking visuals alongside that? Whenever I played previous open world games such as Xenoblade Chronicles or Genshin Impact, there were so many moments where I was visually stunned by just how amazing the game looks. In Genshin Impact specifically, I would always try to find the highest point I could climb to and take a screenshot. In this game, the only screenshot I took of was of this moment here. When I went back to take a look at the areas for this video, I often felt that the environments were very bland or even disgusting at times. The Obsidian Fieldlands was just kind of the same thing over and over again. There's no variety in the colours and the environment barely changes. There's no interesting landmarks here to reel me in with their beauty either. Compare this to Xenoblade Chronicles and its attempts at designing grassy landscapes. There's a lot more of a vibrant green throughout, so it's a lot more pleasant to look at. Alongside this, the environment doesn't just use the same texture of grass over and over again. There's more variety with the foliage that's scattered about. Whenever you look out into the distance, there's always something more interesting going on. You could attribute this to the fact that Xenoblade Chronicles environments takes place on incredibly large creatures, and that's the reason as to why the game can be so much more creative with its environments, which is fair enough I guess. But still, in Legends Arceus, no matter where you go, there is nothing in the distance to entice you to go there. The Crimson Mirelands gets a little bit more interesting with its swamp-like environments, but then you get to the Cobalt coastlands and in the distance it's just this smear of dark green and brown. It doesn't look nice. This extends to the Coronet Highlands as well. Surprisingly, my favourite area was the Alabaster Icelands, which is strange because it's literally just white over and over again. But I guess in this case it makes more sense because what else would you see in a snowy area? I guess I just enjoyed how grand the mountains looked, and exploring one of the really high peaks made me feel as if I was genuinely trekking through somewhere dangerous. When you visit Jubilife Village, the way the game looks takes a drastic turn for the positive, but that's a given considering that the area is mostly man-made. The exterior of the houses were always a nice sight to look at, and I'm glad that they didn't make the roofs all the same colour. There's a lot of variety going on here, and I'm glad that it perfectly expresses the basic human need to not stare at the same thing over and over again. One thing that bugged me, however, was how lifeless the village felt at times. NPCs will just kind of stand there in the exact same spot and stare off into the distance. At most you'll get an animation of a character brushing the ground or tending to their farm. Compare this to a game such as Genshin Impact, where NPCs will often have animations of them doing something or even walking around towns. I wish there was just more in this village to make it feel more lifelike instead of just having it feel like a ghost town with puppets just standing there. What did feel lifelike, however, was the interior of houses. I was streaming the game to a friend when I first started playing, and when I entered my own house she described it as cute, and I honestly can't think of a better word to describe it. There's details within these houses to make them feel really comforting. Whenever you move further into them, your character automatically takes off their shoes, which is a nice nod to Japanese culture. The offices within the Galaxy building are stacked high with books and papers. It really feels as if this place is always hard at work with its research. Just to look at Cylene's desk already gives you a strong impression of what kind of person she is. These small interior details really add up to give the insides of houses more personality. It's no surprise at this point, but the designs of characters are really appealing. The Pokemon series has shown time and time again that one of its biggest strengths is character designs, and this game is no exception. I love the contrasting colours used for Adamant and Irida, representing how they're part of opposing clans. Volo looks very calm and collected, and I love the traveller vibe they have going for him. Cylene's design is a lot less out there, but this fits perfectly with the serious tone of her personality. The thing is with a lot of these characters is that they were obviously designed to look like the ancestors of characters from the current games. For example, Mai looks incredibly similar to Marley, and Elezu looks a lot like Mars. They managed to pull this vibe off without making the characters look like mirror images of who they're related to, so that's really impressive. When diving deeper into who these characters are, however, I gotta say they're not really all that interesting. The assistant character really isn't that much more of a person when compared to the assistant character from Generation 4. Occasionally they'll bring up some inner conflict about being afraid to use their Pokemon or not quite matching up to the main character, but this never gets explored ever again. The conflict between the Pearl Clan and the Diamond Clan is rarely ever explored in depth. Adamant and Irida occasionally just mention the conflict and that's kind of it. Maybe I missed something, but their arguments never felt believable. At the start of the game they debate over whether time or space is more important, and this just felt very far-fetched for me. At no point in my life have I ever heard two people discussing which is more important, so this just made no sense. It's also a real shame that their beliefs don't really tie into who they are as characters in an interesting way. It would have been interesting to see issues surrounding time and space being integrated into Adamant and Irida's characters respectively. These are just examples, but perhaps issues such as the fear of the future and how fleeting our past is could have been integrated into Adamant's character. Similarly for Irida, maybe her character could involve her dealing with the growing fear of History's population growing, and how so much space will inevitably be taken up by people. Like I said, these are just ideas, and I think it's just a personal preference of mine for stories to involve thought-provoking topics. I understand that at the end of the day this is a kids game, and children can't really wrap their head around these things. But previous games have definitely dived into some complicated topics, so it wouldn't be too surprising to see them here. But then again, the creators of these games have made it clear they don't think children can distinguish bread from toast. Once again, I think this is just a personal preference of mine, so it's not really a criticism. I know people might roast me for this, and what I'm about to say is a spoiler, so if you care about that then you can skip ahead. When Commander Kamado kicks you out of the village, I honestly really enjoyed this twist. His main reasons for doing so felt very believable. At first I kinda questioned it, but when I reflected on it, it made sense to me. He kicks you out because you're a stranger who fell from the sky and single-handedly quelled all of the noble Pokemon. I can't really remember a game that I've played in the past that brings attention to just how strong the main character can be. Imagine if someone fell out of the sky in our world and started ending conflicts by throwing food at people. I would be scared. I don't like having food thrown at me. It makes sense for him to kick you out. The feats that you perform are unheard of, and of course I'd be in fear if that power could potentially be turned against me. The twist doesn't come out of nowhere either. He does make it clear he will do anything for the village if it comes down to it. The last thing I want to discuss in this video is the game's music. It has so much charm to it, and whenever I heard a track which contained elements from previous songs from Generation 4, I couldn't help but smile. The best part about these new tracks is that they will always play at unexpected times. For example, when I was near Grand Tree Arena, a track started playing which sounded awfully familiar to Eterna Forest theme, and then it hit me. This place is probably where Eterna Forest would be in the future. Jubilife City's theme is one of my favourite tracks from any game period. When you enter Jubilife Village, the track that plays doesn't instantly remind you of Jubilife City, but then as it goes on it starts to sound more and more like it. This is the magic that this game's soundtrack has. It gives off such a feeling of familiarity the more and more you listen to its tracks, and is honestly such a joy to listen to. To conclude this video, I think what Legends Arceus truly succeeds at is refining the already existing mechanics of the Pokemon Mainline Series. Battling feels incredibly seamless now, and there's some much needed quality of life introductions too. Catching Pokemon isn't just a tedious slog of throwing Pokeballs over and over again until you catch them. You have different approaches, and this makes the process all the more fun. However, with that being said, I think the open world nature of this game could be a lot more fleshed out. There needs to be more to do other than just catching Pokemon. I know that this is the whole series gimmick, but it would really lend a hand to the overall enjoyment of the game if there was just more to explore and if there was more of a reason to as well. Also, there just needs to be more interesting environments. I want to be visually stunned when playing games like these, and there were no moments at all for me that made me feel like that. I'm also still eagerly anticipating a game that rivals the narrative and characters from Generation 5. This game wasn't really able to reach those heights. At the end of the day, despite me saying all of that, I still really enjoyed this game, and I know you're probably sick of hearing this, but it definitely is a step in the right direction, and I'm looking forward to what the Pokemon series can provide us with next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.